Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Concluded. To make this monolithic state majestic and holy without relying upon a Christianity normally hostile to him, Frederick strove to restore in his own person all the awe and splendor that had hedged a Roman emperor. His exquisite coins were stamped with no Christian word or symbol, but with the circular legend IMP ROM Caesar AUG, and on the reverse was the Roman eagle encircled with the name Fredericus. The people were taught that the emperor was, in a sense, the Son of God. His laws were the divine justice codified, and were referred to as Justitia, almost the third person of a new trinity. Anxious to place himself beside the old Roman emperors in the history and galleries of art, Frederick commissioned sculptors to carve his likeness in stone. A bridgehead at the Volturno, a gate at Capua, were adorned with reliefs in ancient style of himself and his aides. Nothing remains of these works except a female head of great beauty. This pre-Renaissance attempt to revive classic art failed, washed away by the Gothic wave. Despite his near divinity and royal industry, Frederick found it possible to enjoy life at all levels in his Foggia court. An army of slaves, many of them Saracens, ministered to his wants and managed the bureaucracy. In 1235, his second wife having died, he married again, but Isabella of England could not understand his mind or morals and retired into the background, while Frederick consorted with mistresses and begot an illegitimate son. His enemies charged him with maintaining a harem, and Gregory IX accused him of sodomy. Frederick explained that all these white or black ladies or lads were used only for their skill in song, dance, acrobatics, or other entertainment traditional in royal courts. In addition to these, he kept a menagerie of wild beasts, and sometimes he traveled with a retinue of leopards, lynxes, lions, panthers, apes, and bears, led on a chain by Saracen slaves. Frederick loved hunting and hawking, collected strange birds, and wrote for his son Manfred an admirable and scientific treatise on falconry. Next to hunting, he took delight in educated and graceful conversation, delicato parlare. He preferred the meeting of true minds to the joust of arms. He himself was the most cultured causeur of his time, and was noted for his wit and repartee. This Frederick was his own Voltaire. He spoke 9 languages and wrote 7. He corresponded in Arabic with Al-Kamil, whom he called his dearest friend after his own sons, in Greek with his son-in-law, the Greek Emperor John Vatatzes, and in Latin with the Western world. His associates, especially Piero delle Vigne, formed their admirable Latin style on the classics of Rome. They keenly felt and emulated the classic spirit, and almost anticipated the humanists of the Renaissance. Frederick himself was a poet whose Italian verses won Dante's praise. The love poetry of Provence and Islam entered his court, and was taken up by the young nobles who served there, and the emperor, like some Baghdad potentate, loved to relax after a day of administration or hunting or war, with pretty women around him and poets to sing his glory and their charms. As he grew older, Frederick turned more and more to science and philosophy. Here, above all, he was stirred by the Moslem heritage of Sicily. He read many Arabic masterpieces himself, brought Moslem and Jewish scientists and philosophers to his court, and paid scholars to translate into Latin the scientific classics of Greece and Islam. He was so fond of mathematics that he persuaded the Sultan of Egypt to send him a famous mathematician, Al-Hanifi, and he was intimate with Leonardo Fibonacci, the greatest Christian mathematician of the age. He shared some of the superstitions of his time and delved into astrology and alchemy. He lured to his court the polymath Michael Scott, and studied occult science with him, and chemistry, metallurgy, and philosophy. His curiosity was universal. He sent questions in science and philosophy to scholars at his court, and as far abroad as Egypt, Arabia, Syria, and Iraq. He kept a zoological garden for study rather than for amusement, and organized experiments in the breeding of poultry, pigeons, horses, camels, and dogs. His laws establishing closed seasons for hunting were based on careful records of pairing and breeding seasons, for which the animals of Apulia were said to have written him a vote of thanks. His legislation included an enlightened regulation of medical practice, operations, and the sale of drugs. He favored the dissection of cadavers, Moslem physicians marveled at his knowledge of anatomy. The extent of his learning in philosophy appears in his request to some Moslem savants to resolve certain discrepancies between the views of Aristotle and Alexander of Aphrodisias on the eternity of the world. "O fortunate emperor," exclaimed Michael Scott, "I verily believe that if ever a man could escape death by his learning, it would be you." Lest the learning of the scholars whom he had assembled should die with their deaths, Frederick founded in 1224 the University of Naples, a rare example of a medieval university established without ecclesiastical sanction. He called to its faculty scholars in all arts and sciences, and paid them high salaries. He assigned subsidies to enable poor but qualified students to attend. He forbade the youths of his regno to go outside of it for their higher education. Naples, he hoped, would soon rival Bologna as a school of law and would train men for public administration. Was Frederick an atheist? He had been pious in his youth and perhaps retained the basic tenets of Christianity till his crusade. Intimate intercourse with Moslem leaders and thinkers seems to have ended his Christian faith. He was attracted by Moslem learning and considered it far superior to the Christian thought and knowledge of his day. At the Diet of German Princes in Friuli in 1232, he cordially received a Moslem deputation, and later, in the sight of bishops and princes, joined the Saracens in a banquet celebrating a Mohammedan religious feast. It was said by his rivals, reports Matthew Paris, that the emperor agreed and believed in the law of Mohammed more than that of Jesus Christ, and was more a friend to the Saracens than to the Christians. A rumor credited by Gregory IX charged him with saying that 3 conjurers so craftily led away their contemporaries as to gain the mastery of the world, Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed. All Europe buzzed with this blasphemy. Frederick denied the charge, but it helped to turn public opinion against him in the final crisis of his life. He was unquestionably something of a freethinker. He had his doubts about the creation of the world in time, personal immortality, the virgin birth, and other doctrines of the Christian faith. In rejecting trial by ordeal, he asked, "How could a man believe that the natural heat of glowing iron will turn cool without an adequate cause, or that because of a seared conscience the element of water will refuse to accept, or submerge, the accused?" In all his reign he built one Christian church. Within limits he gave freedom of worship to the diverse faiths in his kingdom. Greek Catholics, Mohammedans, and Jews were allowed to practice their religions unmolested, but, with one exception, they could not teach in the university or rise to official position in the state. All Moslems and Hebrews were required to wear a dress that would distinguish them from Christians, and the poll tax that Moslem rulers levied on Christians and Jews in Islam was here levied upon Jews and Saracens as a substitute for military service. Conversion from Christianity to Judaism or Islam was severely punished in Frederick's laws. But when in 1235 the Jews of Fulda were accused of ritual murder, the killing of a Christian child to use its blood at the Passover festival, Frederick came to their rescue and denounced the story as a cruel legend. He had several Jewish scholars at his court. The great anomaly of this rationalist's reign was the persecution of heresy. Frederick did not allow liberty of thought and speech, even to the professors in his university. It was a privilege confined to himself and his associates. Like most rulers, he recognized the necessity of religion for social order, and could not allow it to be undermined by his savants. Besides, the suppression of heresy facilitated an intermittent peace with the popes. While some other monarchs of the 13th century hesitated to cooperate with the Inquisition, Frederick gave it his full support. The popes and their greatest enemy agreed in this alone. 3. Empire versus papacy. As Frederick's rule at Foggia developed, his far-reaching aims became ever clearer: to establish his rule throughout Italy, to unify Italy and Germany in a restored Roman Empire, and perhaps to make Rome again the political as well as the religious capital of the Western world. When in 1226 he invited the nobles and cities of Italy to a diet at Cremona, he showed his hand by including in his invitation the Duchy of Spoleto, then a papal state, and by marching his troops through the lands of the popes. The Pope forbade the nobles of Spoleto to attend. The Lombard cities, suspecting that Frederick planned to subject them to a real instead of nominal submission to the empire, refused to send delegates. Instead, they formed the Second Lombard League, in which Milan, Turin, Bergamo, Brescia, Mantua, Bologna, Vicenza, Verona, Padua, and Treviso pledged themselves to a defensive and offensive alliance for 25 years. The Diet was never held. In 1234 his son Henry revolted against his father and allied himself with the Lombard League. Frederick rode up from southern Italy to Worms, without an army but with plenty of cash. The rebellion collapsed at the news of his coming or the touch of his gold. Henry was put into prison, languished there for 7 years, and then, while being transferred to another place of confinement, rode his horse over a cliff to death. Frederick went on to Mainz, presided over a diet there, and persuaded many of the assembled nobles to join him in a campaign for the restoration of imperial power in Lombardy. So aided, he defeated the army of the League at Corte Nuova in 1237. All the cities surrendered but Milan and Brescia. Gregory IX offered to mediate, but Frederick's dream of unity could not be reconciled with the Italian love of liberty. At this juncture, Gregory, though 90 and ailing, decided to throw in his lot with the League, and risk the whole temporal power of the popes on the issue of war. He had no fondness for the Lombard towns. He, too, like Frederick, considered their liberty a license to chaotic strife, and he knew that they harbored heretics openly hostile to the wealth and temporal power of the Church. At this very time the heretics of besieged Milan were defiling altars and turning crucifixes upside down. But if Frederick overcame these cities, the Papal States would be engulfed within a united Italy and a united empire, dominated by a foe of Christianity and the Church. In 1238 Gregory persuaded Venice and Genoa to join him and the League in war against Frederick. In a powerful encyclical he charged the emperor with atheism, blasphemy, and despotism, and a desire to destroy the authority of the Church. In 1239 he excommunicated him, ordered every Roman Catholic prelate to proclaim him an outlaw, and absolved his subjects from their oath of allegiance. Frederick replied in a circular letter to the kings of Europe, repudiating the charge of heresy and accusing the Pope of wishing to destroy the empire and to reduce all kings to subservience to the papacy. The final struggle between empire and papacy was on. The kings of Europe sympathized with Frederick, but paid small heed to his appeal for help. The nobility in Germany and Italy sided with him, hoping to restore the cities to feudal obedience. In the cities themselves, the middle and lower classes were generally for the Pope, and the old German terms Weibling and Welf, in the forms of Ghibelline and Guelph, were revived to signify respectively the adherents of the empire and the defenders of the papacy. Even in Rome this division held, and Frederick had many supporters there. As he approached Rome with a small army, one city after another opened its gates to him as to a second Caesar. Gregory anticipated capture and led a mournful procession of priests through the capital. The courage and frailty of the old pope touched the hearts of the Romans, and many took up arms to protect him. Unwilling to force the issue, Frederick bypassed Rome and wintered at Foggia. He had persuaded the German princes to crown his son Conrad king of the Romans in 1237. He had placed his son-in-law, the able but brutal Ezzelino de Romano, over Vicenza, Padua, and Treviso, and had set over the other surrounded cities his favorite son Enzio, in face and figure our very image, handsome, proud, and gay, brave in battle and accomplished in poetry. In the spring of 1240 the emperor captured Ravenna and Faenza, and in 1241 he destroyed Benevento, the center of the papal forces. His fleet intercepted a Genoese convoy carrying toward Rome a group of French, Spanish, and Italian cardinals, bishops, abbots, and priests. Frederick confined them in Apulia as hostages to bargain with. He soon released the French, but his long detention of the rest and the death of several in his prisons shocked a Europe accustomed to consider the clergy inviolable, and many now believed that Frederick was the Antichrist predicted some years before by the mystic Joachim of Flora. Frederick offered to release the prelates if Gregory would make peace, but the old pope remained firm even to his death in 1241. Innocent IV was more conciliatory. At the urging of St. Louis, he agreed on terms of peace in 1244. But the Lombard cities refused to ratify this agreement and reminded Innocent that Gregory had pledged the papacy against a separate peace. Innocent left Rome secretly and fled to Lyon. Frederick resumed the war, and no force seemed now capable of preventing his conquest and absorption of the Papal States and the establishment of his power in Rome. Innocent summoned the prelates of the Church to the Council of Lyon. The council renewed the excommunication of the emperor, and deposed him as an immoral, impious, and unfaithful vassal of his acknowledged suzerain the Pope, this in 1245. At the Pope's urging, a group of German nobles and bishops chose Henry Raspe as anti-emperor, and when he died they named William of Holland to succeed him. Excommunication was pronounced against all supporters of Frederick, and religious services were interdicted in all regions loyal to him. A crusade was proclaimed against him and Enzio, and those who had taken the cross for the redemption of Palestine were granted all the privileges of crusaders if they joined the war against the infidel emperor. Surrendering to a fury of hatred and revenge, Frederick now burned all bridges behind him. He issued a reform manifesto, denouncing the clergy as slaves to the world, drunk with self-indulgence. The increasing stream of their wealth has stifled their piety. In the Regno he confiscated the treasures of the church to finance his war. When a town in Apulia led a conspiracy to capture him, he had the ringleaders blinded, then mutilated, then killed. Receiving a call for help from his son Conrad, he set out for Germany. At Turin he learned that Parma had overthrown his garrison, that Enzio was in peril, and that all northern Italy and even Sicily were in revolt. He put down rebellion after rebellion in town after town, took hostages from each of them, and slew these men when their towns rebelled. Prisoners found to be messengers of the Pope had their hands and feet cut off, and Saracen soldiers, immune to Christian tears and threats, were used as executioners. During the siege of Parma, Frederick, impatient of inaction, went off with Enzio and 50 knights to hunt waterfowl in the neighboring marshes. While they were away, the men and women of Parma came out in a desperate sortie, overwhelmed the disordered and leaderless forces of the emperor, captured the emperor's treasury, his harem, and his menagerie. He levied heavy taxes, raised a new army, and resumed the struggle. Evidence was brought to him that his trusted premier, Piero delle Vigne, was conspiring to betray him. Frederick had him arrested and blinded, whereupon Piero beat his head against the wall of his jail till he died in 1249. In that same year news came that Enzio had been captured by the Bolognese in battle at La Fossota. About the same time, Frederick's doctor tried to poison him. The quick succession of these blows broke the spirit of the emperor. He retired to Apulia and took no further part in the war. In 1250 his generals won many successes, and the tide seemed to have turned. St. Louis, captured by Moslems in Egypt, demanded of Innocent IV an end to the war so that Frederick might come to the Crusaders' aid. But even as hope revived, the body failed. Dysentery, the humbling nemesis of medieval kings, struck the proud emperor down. He asked for absolution and received it. The freethinker donned the garb of a Cistercian monk and died at Fiorentino on December 13th, 1250. People whispered that his soul had been borne off by devils through the pit of Mount Etna into hell. His influence was not apparent. His empire soon collapsed, and a greater chaos ruled it than when he came. The unity for which he fought disappeared even in Germany, and the Italian cities followed liberty and its creative stimulus through disorder to the piecemeal tyranny of dukes and condottieri, who, hardly knowing it, inherited the unmorality of Frederick, his intellectual freedom, and his patronage of letters and arts. The virtu, or masculine unscrupulous intelligence of the Renaissance despots, was an echo of Frederick's character and mind, without his grace and charm. The replacement of the Bible with the classics, of faith with reason, of God with nature, of providence with necessity, appeared in the thought and court of Frederick, and, after an orthodox interlude, captured the humanists and philosophers of the Renaissance. Frederick was the man of the Renaissance a century before its time. Machiavelli's prince had Caesar Borgia in mind, but it was Frederick who had prepared its philosophy. Nietzsche had Bismarck and Napoleon in mind, but he acknowledged the influence of Frederick, the first of Europeans according to my taste. Posterity, shocked by his morals, fascinated by his mind, and vaguely appreciating the grandeur of his imperial vision, applied to him again and again the epithets coined by Matthew Paris: stupor mundi et immutator mirabilis, the marvelous transformer and wonder of the world. 6. The Dismemberment of Italy. Frederick's will left the empire to his son, Conrad IV, and appointed his illegitimate son Manfred regent of Italy. Revolts against Manfred broke out almost everywhere in Italy. Naples, Spoleto, Ancona, Florence submitted to papal legates. "Let the heavens rejoice and the earth be glad," exclaimed Innocent IV. The victorious Pope returned to Italy, made Naples his military headquarters, moved to annex the Regno to the Papal States, and planned a less direct suzerainty over the northern Italian towns. But these cities, while joining the Pope in his Te Deum, were resolved to defend their independence against pontiffs as well as emperors. Meanwhile, Ezzelino and Uberto Pallavicino held several of the cities in fealty to Conrad. Neither of these men had any respect for religion. Heresy flourished under their rule. There was danger that all northern Italy would be lost to the Church. Suddenly young Conrad, with a fresh army of Germans, came down over the Alps, reconquered disaffected towns, and entered the Regno in triumph, only to die of malaria in May of 1254. Manfred assumed charge of the imperial forces and routed a papal army near Foggia on December 2nd. Innocent was on his deathbed when the news of this defeat reached him. He died in despair on December 7th, murmuring, "Lord, because of his iniquity, thou hast corrupted man." The rest of the tale is a brilliant chaos. Pope Alexander IV, from 1254 to 1256, organized a crusade against Ezzelino. The tyrant was wounded and captured. He refused doctors, priests, and food, and died of self-starvation, impenitent and unshrived, in 1259. His brother Alberigo, likewise guilty of brutalities and crimes, was also captured, and was made to witness the torture of his family. Then his flesh was torn from his body with pincers, and while he was still alive he was tied to a horse and dragged to death. Christians and atheists alike now ran to savagery, except for the gay and charming bastard Manfred. Having defeated the papal troops again at Monteperto in 1260, he remained for the next 6 years master of South Italy. He had time to hunt and sing and write poetry, and had not his like in the world, said Dante, for playing of stringed instruments. Pope Urban IV, from 1261 to 1264, despairing of finding in Italy a corrective for Manfred, and perceiving that the papacy must henceforth rely on France for protection, appealed to Louis IX to accept the two Sicilies as a fief. Louis refused, but allowed his brother, Charles of Anjou, to receive from Urban the kingdom of Naples and Sicily in 1264. Charles marched through Italy with 30,000 French troops and routed Manfred's lesser force. Manfred leaped amid the enemy and died a nobler death than his sires. In the following year, a lad of 15, Conradin, son of Conrad, came down from Germany to challenge Charles. He was defeated at Tagliacozzo, and was publicly beheaded in the market square of Naples in 1268. With him and the death of the long-imprisoned Enzio 4 years later, the House of Hohenstaufen reached a pitiful end. The Holy Roman Empire became a ceremonious ghost, and the leadership of Europe passed to France. Charles made Naples his capital, established in the two Sicilies a French nobility and bureaucracy, French soldiery, monks, and priests, and ruled and taxed with a scornful absolutism that made the region long for a resurrected Frederick, and inclined Pope Clement IV to mourn the papal victory. On Easter Monday of 1282, as Charles was preparing to lead his fleet to conquer Constantinople, the populace of Palermo, their hatred unleashed by the insulting familiarity of a French gendarme with a Sicilian bride, rose in violent revolt and killed every Frenchman in the city. The accumulated bitterness may be judged from the savagery with which Sicilian men ripped open with their swords the wombs of Sicilian women made pregnant by French soldiers or officials, and trampled the alien embryos to death under their feet. Other cities followed Palermo's lead, and over 3,000 Frenchmen in Sicily were slaughtered in a massacre known as the Sicilian Vespers, because it began at the hour of evening prayer. French ecclesiastics in the island were not spared. Churches and convents were invaded by the normally pious Sicilians, and monks and priests were slain without benefit of clergy. Charles of Anjou swore 1,000 years of revenge and promised to leave Sicily a blasted, barren, uninhabited rock. Pope Martin IV excommunicated the rebels and proclaimed a crusade against Sicily. Unable to defend themselves, the Sicilians offered their island to Pedro III of Aragon. Pedro came with an army and a fleet, and established the House of Aragon as kings of Sicily in 1282. Charles made futile efforts to recapture the island. His fleet was destroyed. He died of exhaustion and chagrin at Foggia in 1285, and his successors, after 17 years of vain struggle, contented themselves with the kingdom of Naples. North of Rome, the Italian cities played empire against papacy and maintained a heady liberty. At Milan, the Della Torre family ruled to the general satisfaction for 20 years. A coalition of nobles under Otto Visconti captured office in 1277, and the Visconti, as Capitani or Duci, gave Milan competent oligarchic government for 170 years. Tuscany, including Arezzo, Florence, Siena, Pisa, and Lucca, had been bequeathed to the papacy by the Countess Matilda in 1107, but this theoretic papal tenure seldom interfered with the right of the cities to rule themselves or to find their own despots. Siena, like so many Tuscan towns, had a proud past going back to Etruscan days. Ruined in the barbarian invasions, it revived in the 8th century as a midway stop on the road of pilgrimage and commerce between Florence and Rome. We hear of merchant guilds there in 1192, then of craft guilds, then of bankers. The House of Buonsignori, founded in 1209, became one of the leading mercantile and financial institutions in Europe. Its agents were everywhere. Its loans to merchants, cities, kings, and popes totaled an enormous sum. Florence and Siena contested the control of the Via Francesa that connected them. The two commercial cities fought exhausting wars with each other intermittently from 1207 to 1270. And as Florence supported the popes in the struggles between empire and papacy, Siena supported the emperors. The victory of Manfred at Monteperto in 1260 was chiefly a victory of Siena over Florence. The Sienese, though fighting against the Pope, ascribed their success in that battle to their patron saint, the Virgin Mother of God. They gave Siena to Mary as a fief, placed the proud legend Civitas Virginis on their coins, and laid the keys of the city at the feet of the Virgin in the great cathedral which they had dedicated to her name. Every year they celebrated the feast of her Assumption into heaven with a solemn and stirring ceremony. On the eve of the festival, all the citizens, from the age of 80 to 70, each holding a lighted candle, formed in procession, according to their parishes, behind their priests and their magistrates, marched to the Duomo, and renewed their vows of fealty to the Virgin. On the feast day itself another procession came, of representatives from conquered or dependent cities, villages, and monasteries. These delegates too marched to the cathedral, brought gifts, and repeated their oath of allegiance to the Commune of Siena and its queen. In the city square, Il Campo, a great fair was held on this day. Goods from 100 cities could be bought there. Acrobats, singers, and musicians performed, and the booth provided for gambling was second in attendance only to Mary's shrine. The century from 1260 to 1360 saw the apogee of Siena. In those 100 years it built the cathedral, 1245 to 1339, the massive Palazzo Pubblico, 1310 to 1320, and the lovely Campanile, 1325 to 1344. Niccolo Pisano carved a lordly fountain for the Duomo in 1266. And by 1311, Duccio di Buoninsegna was adorning Sienese churches with some of the earliest masterpieces of Renaissance painting. But the proud city undertook more than it could finance. The victory of Monteperto was fatal to Siena. The defeated pope laid an interdict upon the town, forbidding the entry of goods or the payment of debts, and many Sienese banks failed. In 1270, Charles of Anjou incorporated the chastened city into the Guelph or Papal League. Thereafter, Siena was dominated and outshone by her ruthless rival in the north. 7. The Rise of Florence, 1095 to 1308. Florentia, named for its flowers, had begun some 2 centuries before Christ as a trading post on the Arno, where it received the Mugnoni. Ruined by the barbarian invasions, it recovered in the 8th century as a crossroads on the Via Francesa between France and Rome. Ready access to the Mediterranean encouraged maritime trade. Florence acquired a large mercantile fleet which brought in dyes and silk from Asia, wool from England and Spain, and exported finished textiles to half the world. A zealously guarded trade secret enabled Florentine dyers to color silks and woolens in shades of beauty unsurpassed even in the long-skilled East. The great wool guilds, the Arte della Lana and the Arte de Calimala, imported their own materials and made lush profits in transforming them into finished goods. Most of the work was done in small factories, some of it in city or rural homes. The merchants provided the materials, collected the marketable product, and paid by the piece. The competition of home workers, chiefly women, kept factory wages low. The weavers were not allowed to take united action to raise their wages or better their working conditions, and they were forbidden to emigrate. To further promote discipline, the employers persuaded the bishops to issue pastoral letters to be read from all pulpits 4 times a year, threatening with ecclesiastical censure, even excommunication, the worker who repeatedly wasted wool. This industry and trade needed ready supplies of investment capital. and soon the bankers contested with the merchants the control of Florentine life. They acquired large estates through foreclosures. They became indispensable to the Pope through financial control of ecclesiastical properties mortgaged to them, and in the 13th century they had almost a monopoly of papal finance in Italy. The general alliance of Florence with the popes in their struggle against the emperors was motivated partly by this financial nexus, partly by fear of imperial and aristocratic encroachments upon municipal and mercantile liberties. The bankers were therefore the chief supporters of the papal party in Florence. It was they who financed the invasion of Italy by Charles of Anjou through a loan of 148,000 livres, or $29.6 million, to Pope Urban IV. When Charles seized Naples, the Florentine bankers, to secure repayment, were allowed to mint the coin and collect the taxes of the new kingdom, to monopolize the trade in armor, silk, wax, oil, and grain, and the supply of arms and provisions to the troops. These Florentine bankers, if we may believe Dante, were not the polished manipulators of our age, but coarse and greedy buccaneers of lucre, who made fortunes by foreclosures and charged unconscionable interest on loans, like that Folco Portinari who fathered Dante's Beatrice. They spread their operations over a wide region. About 1277 we find two Florentine banking firms, the Brunelleschi and the Medici, controlling finance in Nîmes. The Florentine house of Francesi financed the wars and intrigues of Philip IV, and from his reign Italian bankers dominated French finance till the 17th century. Edward I of England borrowed 200,000 gold florins, or $2.16 million, from the Frescobaldi of Florence in 1295. Such loans were risky and subjected the economic life of Florence to distant and apparently irrelevant events. A multiplication of political investments and governmental defaults, capped by the fall of Boniface VIII and the removal of the papacy to Avignon in 1307, brought a series of bank failures to Italy, a general depression, and intensified class war. Three classes divided the secular life of Florence: the popolo minuto, or little people, shopkeepers and artisans; the popolo grasso, or fat people, employers or businessmen; and the grandi, or nobles. The artisans, grouped in arti minori, or lesser guilds, were largely manipulated in politics by the masters, merchants, and financiers who filled the arti maggiori, or major guilds. In the competition to control the government, the little and the fat people united for a time as popolani against the nobles, who claimed ancient feudal dues from the city and supported first the emperors and then the popes against municipal liberties. The popolani organized a militia in which every able-bodied resident of the city had to serve and to learn the arts of war. So prepared, they captured and demolished the castles of the nobles in the countryside and forced the nobles to come and dwell within the city walls under municipal law. The nobles, still rich with rural rents, built palace castles in the town, divided into factions, fought one another in the streets, and competed to see which faction should overthrow the limited democracy of Florence and set up an aristocratic constitution. In 1247, the Uberti faction led a Ghibelline revolt to establish in Florence a government favorable to Frederick. The Popolani resisted bravely, but a detachment of German knights routed them, and the Florentine democracy fell. The leading Guelphs fled from the city. Their homes were torn down in unforgetting revenge for their destruction of feudal castles a century before. Thereafter, each fluctuation of victory in the war of the classes and factions was celebrated by the exile of the defeated leaders and the confiscation or destruction of their property. For 3 years, the Ghibelline aristocracy, backed by a garrison of German soldiers, ruled the city. Then, as an aftermath of Frederick's death, a Guelph revolt of the middle and lower classes captured the government in 1250 and appointed a Capitano del Popolo to check the Podesta, as the ancient tribunes of the people had checked the consuls of Rome. The exiled Guelphs were recalled, and the triumphant bourgeoisie cemented its domestic success with wars against Pisa and Siena to control the road of Florentine commerce to the sea and to Rome. The richer merchants became a new nobility and sought to confine state offices to their class. The defeat of Florence at Monteperto by Siena and Manfred entailed a second flight of the Guelph leaders, and for 6 years Florence was ruled by Manfred's delegates. The collapse of the imperial cause in 1268 brought the Guelphs back to power, nominally subject to Charles of Anjou. To control the Podesta, who was an appointee of Charles, they established a body of 12 anziani, ancients or elders, to advise that official, and a council of 100, without whose sanction no important measure nor any expenditure is to be undertaken. Taking advantage of Charles's preoccupation with the Sicilian Vespers, the bourgeoisie in 1282 put through a constitutional change by which a priory of the arts, composed of 6 priori, or foremen, chosen from the greater guilds, became in effect the ruling body in the city government. Through all these mutations, the office of podesta survived, but shorn of power. The merchants and the bankers were supreme. The vanquished party of the old nobility reorganized itself under the handsome and haughty Corso Donati, and for unknown reasons received the name of Neri, the blacks. The new nobility of bankers and merchants, led by the Cerchi family, took the name of Bianchi, the whites. Hopeless of aid from the shattered empire, the old nobility turned to the Pope for succor from the triumphant bourgeoisie. Through the Spini, his Florentine agents in Rome, Donati planned with Boniface VIII to capture control of Florence. The Tuscan factions had infected the Papal States, and Boniface despaired of restoring order there unless he could secure a decisive voice in the municipal governments of Tuscany. A Florentine attorney learned of these negotiations and accused 3 Spini agents in Rome of treason to Florence. The priori condemned the 3 men in April 1300, whereupon the Pope threatened to excommunicate the accusers. A group of armed nobles of the Donati faction assaulted certain officers of the guilds. The priory, of which Dante was now a member, exiled several nobles in defiance of the Pope in June 1300. Boniface appealed to Charles of Valois to enter Italy, subdue Florence, and recapture Sicily from Aragon. Charles reached Florence in November 1301 and announced that he had come only to establish order and peace. But soon thereafter Corso Donati entered the city with an armed band, sacked the houses of the priors who had banished him, threw open the prisons, and released not only his friends but all who cared to escape. Riot ran loose. Nobles and criminals joined in robbing, kidnapping, killing. Warehouses were plundered, heiresses were forced to marry impromptu suitors, and the fathers were compelled to sign rich settlements. Finally, Corso turned out the priors and the podesta. The blacks chose a new priory which submitted all its proposed measures to the black leaders. For 7 years, Corso was the dashing dictator of Florence. The deposed priors were tried, condemned, and banished, including Dante in 1302. 359 whites were sentenced to death, but most of them were allowed to escape into exile. Charles of Valois accepted these events gracefully, and 24,000 florins, or $4.8 million, for his trouble, and departed south. In 1304, the unchecked blacks set fire to the homes of their enemies. 1,400 houses were destroyed, leaving the center of Florence in ashes. The blacks then divided into new factions, and in one of 100 acts of violence, Corso Donati was stabbed to death in 1308. We must remind ourselves again that the historian, like the journalist, is forever tempted to sacrifice the normal to the dramatic, and never quite conveys an adequate picture of any age. During these conflicts of popes and emperors, Guelphs and Ghibellines, blacks and whites, Italy was sustained by a hard-working peasantry. Perhaps then, as now, Italian fields were cultivated with art as well as industry, and were divided and arranged to please the eye as well as feed the flesh. Hills and crags and mountains were carved and terraced to hold grapevines, fruit and nut orchards, and olive trees, and gardens were laboriously walled to check erosion and hold the precious rain. In the cities 100 industries absorbed the great majority of men, and left little time for the strife of speeches, votes, knives, and swords. Merchants and bankers were not all merciless ghouls. They, too, if only by their acquisitive fever, made the cities hum and grow. Nobles like Corso Donati, Guido Cavalcanti, Cangrande della Scala could be men of culture, even if now and then they used their swords to make a point. Women moved with vibrant freedom in this high-spirited society. Love was for them no wordy sham of troubadours, nor the grim fusion of sweating peasants, nor yet the service of a knight to a parsimonious goddess. It was a gallant and ardent amorousness, leading with reckless dispatch to a full-bodied abandonment and unpremeditated motherhood. Here and there in this ferment, teachers maneuvered with desperate patience to insert instruction into reluctant youth. Prostitutes eased the tumescence of imaginative men. Poets instilled their foiled desire into compensatory verse. Artists hungered while seeking perfection. Priests played politics and consoled the bereaved and the poor. And philosophers struggled through a labyrinth of myths toward the bright mirage of truth. There was a stimulus in this society, an excitement and competition that sharpened men's wits and tongues, brought forth their reserve and unsuspected powers, and lured them, even if by their own destruction, to clear the way and set the stage for the Renaissance. Through many pains, and the shedding of blood, would come the great rebirth. This concludes the reading of The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Part 3 continues the story and is available through the Books on Tape service. This book was read by Alexander Adams. Additional titles by Will Durant in the Books on Tape library include Our Oriental Heritage and The Life of Greece. For additional information about them or for help with topics of related interest, please call our customer service department or check our catalog index to find review material. Will you please wind or rewind the tape as appropriate, so the book will be in order for the next person to enjoy? Thank you.